IGen is those born between about 1995 and 2012. So they're the first generation to spend their entire adolescence in the age of the smartphone. Yeah, so of course there's many differences among people based on demographics and other factors, but looking at generational differences shows us that when you were born has a big impact on your behaviors, on your attitudes, on your values. And for iGen, one of those biggest differences is that they grew up and were teens with smartphones, and previous generations didn't have that technology when they were that age. Well, we know that the more hours a day a child or a teen spends on social media, the more likely it is that he or she will be depressed for a number of reasons. If you're spending a lot of time on social media, you may not be sleeping enough or spending enough time with friends in person. Then there's all of the social comparison, comparing yourself to all of the perfect people on social media. So spending lots and lots of time on social media is not a good formula for mental health. And you're depressed and don't have good mental health, and generally you don't have that resilience built up either. Well, I think we just have to think a little bit more about putting regulations and limits on social media. So I and many other people are saying, we should probably raise the minimum age for having social media to 16 and then actually verify age, because then we can protect children and younger teens until they're ready, because social media was not designed for children. It wasn't even designed for teens. It was designed for adults. Yeah, it is difficult because you don't need parental permission to open a social media account. They don't verify age. So there's a lot of kids and teens who go on social media and the parents have no idea. But there are a couple things that parents can do. So one is to put off giving your child a smartphone as long as possible. You can get them an old-fashioned flip phone. There are some phones out there that are going to pare down. They're phones that are actually designed for children. Usually you can call and text and take pictures, and that's it. There's no ability to have social media on it. So just try to make sure that that phone that they have, they can't access social media too easily on it. And if you do give them a smartphone, put parental controls on it. Make it so they have to have your permission to download any apps. Then if they want social media, you have to talk about it. It has to be a conversation rather than them just going and doing it. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that we do have a mental health crisis, that teen depression and loneliness have doubled. And we have data on that from around the world. So the problem with that is the younger someone is when they first have an episode of depression, the more likely it is that they're going to be depressed later in life. So at least for me, that's my biggest concern, is about these mental health challenges possibly following this generation into adulthood. There's definitely some good news about this generation. They are more likely to say, for example, that they want a job where they can be helpful to other people. Another survey shows they're more likely to say that that's an important life goal, is to help others. So I think that's a really big strength for this generation. And they will have challenges to deal with, but they have that empathy and that desire to help. Yeah, so that really is the one that distinguishes iGen or Gen Z the most, is that desire to help. They also do want work-life balance. Millennials talked about that as well, wanting to have more flexibility, not to work way too many hours like a lot of previous generations did. So I think those are really the two biggest differences in the kinds of jobs that they want. One other thing that's interesting, though, this generation has a reputation for they all want to be entrepreneurs and found their own business. At least on average on surveys, it doesn't look like that's particularly true. They're more looking for jobs that are a good steady job where they can get mentoring and where they can build their careers rather than necessarily, being on their own. Yeah, so for managers, I think the important thing is first, just understand that the young employees that you're hiring are different. They're different than young employees were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. That doesn't necessarily mean worse or better. There's trade-offs in every generation, but iGen or Gen Z, they are not like millennials. They are a little more pessimistic than the optimistic millennials. So that's somewhat good. They have more realistic expectations, but they may need more encouragement. They may have more insecurity. And that's also partially based on social media and seeing everybody else's perfect life. So individualism is a cultural system that places more emphasis on the self and less on social rules. So that can sometimes make it a challenge when you're a manager and you need things done, but it just means you have to work together more, that things might be a little more casual, a little bit more informal. But if you explain why and say why something is important and why that job is important, you'll still find that this young generation can be very motivated. They just need a little more context. There's definitely more focus on identity and personalization now than there used to be. So that's certainly a cultural shift. We can see that in the way language is used in books. Words like personalize or identity have become much more commonly used in the last few decades. And I think the younger generations reflect that with more focus on the self and more focus on identity. For baby boomers and Gen Xers, they didn't grow up with these technologies. So they spent their childhood and adolescence in the so-called real world. They related to each other by getting together in person. They often took risks. They often were very independent at an early age. By the time they were 18, almost all had their driver's license and had worked at a job and were very used to going out on dates and going out with their friends. And IGen doesn't do that as much. They take longer to grow up. So they have fewer of these experiences with independence when they're at that 14 to 18 high school age. I think it's always hard to tell exactly what someone else would say about you, much less your own children, given the different roles that you have to play as a parent. But I think, I would hope anyway, they would say that they can talk to me about just about anything. I know my oldest would say that because we talk about everything. Yeah. And they would say that they like coming with me on trips. They would probably say that I really like going to national parks, which is the thing that we do. Well, what I tell them is that making mistakes is how you learn. And every young person has to make mistakes because otherwise you won't learn. You ask any room full of adults, when did you learn the most about yourself? And they'll say, when I made a mistake. So what we usually focus on in my family is, okay, this didn't go so well. What are you going to do next time? That it's a learning experience. So, yep, we're disappointed. This didn't go well. Yes, you shouldn't have done that. What are you going to do next time? First, I'll say parents are in a tough spot these days. So, I am a parent myself. I have a lot of empathy for how difficult parenting is now in the age of social media, in the age of the smartphone. I think there's probably two main things that I think often go wrong. So one is to just assume that technology is harmless. To give a 9-year-old a smartphone with no parental controls on it and just assume everything will be fine. Not seeing any danger in that, because parents are often very focused on physical dangers, and they should be, but they tend not to think that way when they hand their kids a phone. But there are a lot of dangers in the phone for mental health, for being contacted by strangers, for coming across material that's very inappropriate, lots of problems. So I think that's something that happens a lot that parents should think twice about. I think the other thing that happens a lot is that parents assume that their job is to make their kid happy at every moment, and that is not your job as a parent. Your job is to, as a parent, is to raise a child who will be a responsible adult. And that might mean that they're unhappy from time to time because they have to do their homework and go to bed on time and may not always get to do exactly what they want to do and can't be on social media 8 hours a day. Well, I did first get interested in generational differences as an undergraduate. Now I was 21 years old. I was working on my honors thesis and noticed that the way people were scoring on some psychology questionnaires was different than the way people had scored 20 years ago. And the other reason that, that time was good for thinking about those things is there were a lot of books and a lot of media attention on Generation X. And that's my generation. That was the young generation at the time. And I thought they got a lot of things wrong. And it wasn't just from my own personal perspective. I thought they got things wrong. I thought a lot of those books just didn't have any research behind them. They would say things like, oh, Gen Xers have low self-esteem. I'd be like, well, did you give everybody a self-esteem questionnaire? And usually they didn't. So that was one of the things that I did in graduate school was find hundreds and hundreds of studies that did give college students and young people self-esteem questionnaires to see what does it actually look like. And it turns out it's the opposite. Gen Xers, when they were young, had higher self-esteem than baby boomers at the same age. Sometimes, and I think it is a common perception of younger people to say to older people, you don't understand what it's like to be young right now. And they're right, but I think older people could say the same thing. You don't understand what it's like to be this age, and you don't understand what it was like to have grown up 30 years ago or 40 years ago. That was actually one of my biggest goals in my most recent book, Generations, understanding. For the generations to understand each other was my most important goal. I think just listening and realizing that people do have different perspectives. There are generational differences out there. They are real. And to try to have that empathy, to try to take other person's perspective. It's a very hard thing to do, to take somebody else's perspective. But think about how amazing it would be if people did that more often, to try to see how someone else is feeling, to try to see where they're coming from, which can be hard, but very necessary.